Hey, what's going on, guys? We have some breaking news, the news that we have been waiting for, some major fight announcements for UFC 300 coming from UFC President Dana White. And while there's still no main event, these are some big fight announcements for UFC 300. And he also announced some other major fights from now until UFC 300, including UFC 298. I'm going to give my reaction and early prediction for every single one of these fights. And also, I will say this. UFC 300, even though there's a lot of good name value that's been added so far, I feel like it's shaping up to be a major disappointment, but we'll discuss that a little bit later in the video. Let's start right away with UFC 298. We are getting Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa in the middleweight division. And while I love this fight, when I heard this fight announcement, there was no excitement at all. Because Paulo Costa, I mean, how many fights have been canceled, announced, and canceled, announced, and canceled with Paulo Costa? So I can't get excited for a Paulo Costa fight. I don't know if he's even signed the contract. I'm hoping, because I feel like a lot of blame has been shifted onto Paulo Costa and it's UFC announcing fights that weren't signed. And then the most recent fight against Khamzat Chimaev, Paulo Costa had staph infection. But even though it's not necessarily, they're not all Paulo Costa's fault for the reasons why his fights didn't end up happening. I mean, how many has it been now? The Khamzat Chimaev fight. Wasn't there an Ikram Aliskerov fight? There was a previous Robert Whittaker fight. I think there was, at one point, there was a Jarrett Cannonier fight. I can't even remember all the Paulo Costa fights that have been canceled. So I'm not all that excited about it. So it's weird because it is a great fight. It's going down UFC 298. I believe that's February 17th. That's the Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria card. I love the fight, but I'm just already expecting it not to happen. In terms of an early prediction, I'm going to go Paulo Costa. I mean, Robert Whittaker got melted badly by Dricus du Plessis. And I know Paulo Costa's been out for a while. He hasn't fought since he fought Luke Rockhold all the way back at UFC 278, July of 2022, the same card that Leon Edwards got that head kick KO. I know he's been out for a while, but I feel like Robert Whittaker, small for the weight class, he's been kind of, in interviews over the past couple years, he's kind of flirted with retirement a little bit. And then he looked completely checked out against Dricus du Plessis. And maybe du Plessis is just so physical and just so unrelenting with his pressure. Maybe it just made Whittaker look bad. But I'm going to go Costa. Costa's big for the weight class. He's basically made of steel, and he throws a lot of volume. So I could see Whittaker outclassing him, picking him apart from the outside. But after watching Whittaker get melted by Dricus du Plessis, I have to go Paulo Costa if this fight does indeed happen. Another note for UFC 298. The UFC has shifted from UFC 299 to UFC 298. We will get Jeff Neal versus Ian Machado Gary. I already made an in-depth reaction to this for UFC 299. I will link it down in the description since it got shifted. I just made this video literally yesterday. I'll link that down in the description, but an early prediction for that. I love the fight. I think it's a great test for Ian Machado Gary. I'm going Ian Machado Gary. I think he gets it done via decision. I think younger, more athletic, faster on the feet. And I think Jeff Neal has a power advantage and very good striking, but I think Ian Gary will be able to do enough to get a win over Jeff Neal. But I highly advise you to go check out my full breakdown that I will link in the description. Moving on to February 24th. These fights were never really official, but we already had them from reliable sources, and I've already done a video on both these fights as well, which I will also link down in the description, but I'll briefly touch on them. But I want to get to UFC 300. We have Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi. This is going to be a great fight in the flyweight division. I'm going Brandon Moreno, early prediction. I just think he's so good everywhere. Former champion. I think he gets it done against Amir Albazi. And then we have Brian Ortega versus Yair Rodriguez. I'm going Yair Rodriguez. I think, he subbed Ortega in the last fight. People don't give him credit for that. And Yair has unbelievable striking on the feet. Meanwhile, Ortega doesn't have a decent win in 100 years. He's the Colby Covington of the featherweight division, squatting on his ranking. I'm going Yair Rodriguez, but again, I'll link that full video down in the description, which I did a couple weeks ago when these fights were reported by a reliable source. And we also have, before we get to UFC 300, we have the March 30th Atlantic City card. We are getting Aaron Blanchfield versus Manon Fior. This is a banger fight for the women's flyweight division. I'm really looking forward to this matchup. I mean, this is a great matchup. I believe Fior is ranked number 3. Blanchfield's ranked number 2. You have Fior, who's arguably already deserves a title shot. You have Aaron Blanchfield, who arguably already deserves a title shot. Both are kind of waiting in the wings as we see what happens with Grasso and Shevchenko. Probably going to be a trilogy since the last fight was so close. And, you know, you look at their records. I mean, Manafjord coming off a win over Rose Namajunas, coming off a win over Caitlin Chukagian, and on a long win streak. You have Erin Blanchfield coming off a win over Talia Santos, a win over Jessica Andrade, a win over Molly McCann. Molly McCann win doesn't mean that much. But either way, they both looked very impressive in their last few fights. They both look like they're championship caliber. And I think this was the fight we kind of all assumed would get made, depending on if one of them ended up getting a title shot after the last Grasso versus Shevchenko fight. But it looks like we're going to get that trilogy. All signs are pointing to we're getting that trilogy. An early prediction for this fight, this is a very difficult fight because Fior's a very good kickboxer, very strong in the clinch, has good takedown defense, and Erin Blanchfield has unbelievable grappling. Her striking isn't that good. Early prediction, I'm going to say Manafjord. I'm going to say she gets it done on the feet. I'm going to say she's able to stuff the takedowns and win on the feet. I think Blanchfield will have some moments where she gets some positional control, but I think Manafjord is much stronger than a lot of these opponents she's facing, and Blanchfield struggled a bit with Santos in her last fight. So I'm going to go Manafjord in that fight. Love that fight. Unsure if that's going to be a main event. I don't know. It's a fight night card in Atlantic City, so it may, but he didn't announce it as the main event. The other thing I want to note that I kind of forgot is he did announce that Brian Ortega, Yair Rodriguez, and Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi will both be 5 rounds. I think it's Ortega versus Yair that will be the co-main event that will be 5 rounds. Okay, moving on to the fight card you all want to hear about. On April 13th, we are getting UFC 300, and I'm going to go in the order that I think these will be on the card. But first up, we have Bo Nickal versus Cody Brundage. I mean, I'm disappointed in this fight. I'm going to be honest. And I'm disappointed with these 3 fights. We're going to go through 3 fights that were announced for UFC 300. Bo Nickal is going from grocery store cashier to, I don't even know. I mean, we're talking, I don't even know. Produce stocker? Cody Brundage is literally a bum. He's a bum, and I know he got a win over Zach Reese in his last fight, but Zach Reese doesn't know when to let go of a submission because he's being slammed. Fight before that, should have lost to Jacob Malkoun. I almost said Zach Malkoun. Should have lost to Jacob Malkoun. He threw a pity party and got an illegal elbow disqualification. Fight before that, easily out-wrestled by Cedriquez Dumas. Fight before that, out-grappled by Rodolfo Vieira. Fight before that, finished by Mikhail Olashechek. This is a guy that is so bad, he doesn't belong on the UFC roster. So basically, Bo Nickal's going a step down from grocery store cashier. A step down. When he was supposed to fight Tresean Gore, it was like, okay, he might be getting the assistant manager now. But now he's fighting the janitor. That's what he is. It's not even the produce stocker. Cody Brundage is the grocery store janitor. This is a one-sided matchup. That's an easy win for Bo Nickal. And I understand that Bo Nickal's still early on in his MMA career. He's undefeated. He's 5-0. I would have liked to seen a little bit more of a test. I would like to seen them rebook the Tresean Gore fight. I understand Bo Nickal, they're looking at him, oh, this guy could be a future star. He has the wrestling background. A lot of people are hyping him up. He has good power in his hands. But Cody Brundage? I mean, seriously. I favor half my neighborhood to beat Cody Brundage in a bar fight. I really do. He got lucky with that last win. He has no grappling, getting out-grappled with top position from Cedriquez Dumas. I am confident in saying that Bo Nickal will finish Cody Brundage in the first round, barring a fluke KO in the first 20 seconds. I think Bo Nickal, if he wanted to, he could Batista bomb Cody Brundage. Like Cody Brundage Batista bomb Zach Reese. I think Cody Brundage, he might be able to pull off a 619. He may be able to pull off a Stone Cold Stunner. He may be able to pull off a Tombstone. I'm looking at this matchup and I'm not seeing a competitive fight. I'm seeing an utter slaughter by Bo Nickal. But the UFC is just using UFC 300 as a way to showcase Bo Nickal. And I just would have liked to seen something that appeared a little bit more competitive. Just appeared. Because that would be the biggest upset I've ever seen if somehow Cody Brundage wins this fight. He is literal bottom of the barrel UFC talent. Does not even belong in the UFC. I mean, when has he ever had a good win? His best win is Tresean Gore, which is crazy because I'm saying Tresean Gore is better than him. But Tresean Gore is kind of better than him. I know that sounds crazy, but outside of that, I mean, he's losing to Nick Maximoff, who's cut from the organization. It's just, and Cedriquez Dumas beat him not that long ago. What is that, June of this year? And Dumas isn't that good either. So I don't know. I don't love this fight. I just think it's non-competitive. I think Bo Nickal can do anything he wants to him, including a people's elbow. So I'm going Bo Nickal, first round stoppage, first 2 minutes stoppage. I think it's an easy win for Bo Nickal, but I do understand what the UFC is doing. Moving up on the card, another fight added to UFC 300. We have Calvin Kattar versus Aljamain Sterling at featherweight. This is kind of an interesting fight, but to be honest, I think this is another one-sided fight. I think Calvin Kattar beats the brakes off of Aljamain Sterling, and I think this is why the UFC is doing it. I think they hate Aljamain Sterling. I think this is going to be the worst move of Aljamain Sterling's career. I think his career is over, to be honest. I know that sounds like an alarmist. That sounds like I'm, jumping the gun a bit, but at 34 years old, he's taking on Calvin Kattar up a weight class. Aljo already doesn't have good entries to takedowns. He's only really good once he gets your back and gets control. So unless he does that to Calvin Kattar, who's really shown no weakness in grappling, and I know he hasn't been fighting like top-tier grapplers, and, he lost his last 2 fights, but the loss against Arnold Allen was kind of fluky. Maybe he would have lost anyway, and he was getting beaten, but he did kind of jump and injure his knee. Fight before that, lost to Josh Emmett. I thought he won that fight. Fight before that, won against Giga Chikadze. Fight before that, got the brakes beat off him by Max Holloway. Fight before that, beat Dan Ige, beat Jeremy Stevens. Where does Aljamain Sterling threaten Calvin Kattar at all? Calvin Kattar is leaps and bounds better in the striking. He's bigger, he's stronger, and Aljamain Sterling doesn't have great takedown ability. Once he gets you down, he has a jiu-jitsu advantage over Calvin Kattar, but I really believe that this is going to be a one-sided matchup, and that's why I'm already disappointed with UFC 300. I think these are 2 one-sided matchups. The last fight we're going to get to in a second is kind of a banger, but I'm a little bit disappointed with that as well, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, I don't, it's one of those fights where maybe Aljo goes out there and shocks us. Calvin Kattar is coming off a long layoff. He is coming off an injury, and he is 35 himself. But up a weight class, I think Aljamain Sterling is going to be at a massive disadvantage. I think he's going to be much smaller than Calvin Kattar, and I don't see him getting a takedown. I mean, Aljamain Sterling's coming off a KO loss to Sean O'Malley. I think Calvin Kattar has more power, even though he's not known for his power at 45. I think Calvin Kattar beats the brakes off of Aljamain Sterling. I think the UFC hates Aljo, and I think that's why they kind of forced his hand with this fight. Who knows? They might not even let Aljamain Sterling into the arena for all we know. But I'm going Calvin Kattar in this matchup. I think he TKOs Aljamain Sterling, and I don't think this is a super competitive fight. I'm very interested to see your guys' feedback down in the comments on these fights, because maybe I'm crazy. I mean, I'm just kind of processing all these fights as we speak. This news just got announced like 20 minutes ago, but I'm definitely going Calvin Kattar via brutal TKO against Aljamain Sterling. Probably first or second round TKO for Calvin Kattar. All right, moving on to the most notable fight from UFC 300, and this is the last fight I'll be talking about in this video, and that is Jiri Prochazka versus Aleksandar Rakic. This is a banger. This is a fight I thought we would see for a title at some point in time, but we're seeing it, just as a non-title bout. This is going to be a fight that has to do with title contention. Jiri's coming off a title loss against Alex Pereira, where he was looking decent in that fight, but he was coming off a long layoff. Rakic is coming off a long layoff as well. Hurt his leg against Jan Blachowicz back. It's crazy, back in May of 2022. So by the time he fights, he's going to basically have a 2-year layoff. A little bit under a 2-year layoff for Aleksandar Rakic. The reason I kind of hate this matchup, but I do kind of understand, and I do think this is good matchmaking. I think this is a bad matchup for Jiri Prochazka. Jiri Prochazka, he's a wild man. And while I love every single one of Jiri Prochazka's fights, and, he's looked so good against, Glover Teixeira. He looked good against Dominic Reyes, looked good against Volkan Ozdemir. He got chinned against Alex Pereira after a long layoff, and now he's returning on I guess it's not a super quick turnaround, about a 5-month turnaround, against Aleksandar Rakic, who's a massive light heavyweight, unbelievable kickboxer, great grappling, and just massive for the weight class as well. Big, strong in the clinch. I think this could be the end of Jiri Prochazka. He may be a flash in the pan. As quickly as he showed up, he's going to disappear, because Rakic, I get it, he's coming off a long layoff, so maybe Rakic has ring rust, maybe he isn't as good, maybe he gets clipped on the chin, but Rakic is a complete fighter. He's a very complete fighter, has excellent kickboxing, has good, he's good everywhere. The only reason he lost the Jan Blachowicz fight, in my opinion, and honestly, this is pure speculation, you never truly know, I think it's just because he got injured. Whether Jan calls that or not, that remains to be seen. But I think it was trending in his direction. I think Rakic was going to win that fight. Now, Rakic was scheduled to rematch Blachowicz, which was going to be in January at UFC 297. Blachowicz pulled out, had to get surgery, so that fight got canceled. Jiri said, I would fight Rakic. I guess they decided, okay, let's make that for UFC 300. And I just don't love this matchup for Jiri coming off a loss. I know both guys are coming off a loss. I know both guys are ranked in like the top 5 of the light heavyweight division, but I just don't love it right now for Jiri Prochazka, because, to be honest, Rakic may go out there and brutally chin him. I mean, I know Rakic isn't like a crazy finisher, but he has nasty power, and he's just good everywhere. I could see him out grappling Jiri. But I think Yuri's just so wild, leaves his chin out there, coming off a KO over against Alex Pereira, where he took, a decent amount of shots as well. And he's kind of, going against a guy in Rakic who's just very technical, hard to hit, and also can grapple as well. I mean, you go look at his fights. Thiago Santos. Santos has nasty power as well. Went against Anthony Smith, dominated Anthony Smith in the grappling, I believe. Lost against Volkan Ozdemir, but if I remember correctly, I thought Rakic won that fight. I might be misremembering. Finished Jimmy Manuel with a nasty head kick. Finished Devin Clark. And I know this isn't the best quality of opponents, but if you look at Yuri hasn't really fought the best quality of opponents either. And as crazy as that sounds, he's only been in the UFC for, what, 4 fights? The Glover Teixeira win was good, but he took a lot of damage in that fight. The Dominic Reyes win was good, but he took a lot of damage in that fight, and Dominic Reyes is a dead body. The Volkan Ozdemir win was solid, but Volkan Ozdemir put a lot of damage on him as well. So maybe it's just because my bias of Jiri Prochazka, I don't love this fight right now for where he is in his career. So that's why I'm just disappointed in UFC 300. And I'm looking at UFC 298. I'm looking at UFC 299. And I'm just seeing how stacked they are. I love those cards. I'm not making this video to crap on the UFC. We only have 3 fights announced for UFC 300. But the way I'm seeing it right now, and I'm looking at the schedule, and I'm looking at what's available for main events and whatnot, I just feel like 300, maybe it's because the high expectations I have. Maybe it's because the high expectations the MMA community has put for UFC 300. I feel like it's going to be disappointing. I mean, UFC 299 is crazy stacked. Took a bit of a hit losing Gary versus Neal, moving to UFC 298. But I just feel like with these 3 fights, I don't love these matchups, especially the first 2. The first 2, I mean, Bo Nickal, I think he easily beats Brundage. Kattar easily beats Aljamain Sterling. And for an early prediction for Prochazka versus Rakic, I'm going Rakic. Unless Rakic has a lot of ring rust and comes out completely a shell of himself, I have to take Rakic against Jiri Prochazka. I think he's the more complete fighter. He's 31 years old, and he's massive for the weight class. So I'm going Rakic. Maybe I hate that fight just because of a little bit of bias towards Jiri, that I like Jiri. But at the same time, I just feel like, okay, give Jiri, give him the dead body Anthony Smith. Okay, maybe not Anthony Smith. Maybe give him Khalil Roundtree. I think Jiri beats Khalil Roundtree. Maybe something along those lines would still be a banger, but would help kind of give Jiri a little bit of a layup, considering, he lost his only fight in the last 2 years because he was out for such a long time. But overall, we only have 3 fights for UFC 300. I don't want to be an alarmist just yet, but I'm just saying these 3 fights where I felt like a lot of people are probably going to say, oh, these are great fights just because of the name value. There's other fights that I would have much preferred, but I am being a little bit picky right now, considering we have to wait until we see the whole 12, 13, 14 fight card. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm still wondering what the main event's going to be. I'm still holding true to my prediction, which I think it will be Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz 3. That is my prediction for the main event of UFC 300. But let me know what you guys think of all these fights. Let me know what you think of my predictions. Am I being a little bit pessimistic about UFC 300? Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.